Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry. I'm in a different time zone, but it's not that different. Good evening, everybody. It's Saturday night at 10 o'clock Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, where I am, because a bunch of you probably recognize that I'm in my brother DeLon's basement, and this is Starfleet Tactical. And this week we have back TJ Cizadlo and Rob Davidoff to talk about, to continue the Battlestar Galactica series. And so I think that this is actually the last one.
No.
Good. I love it when other people provide content for me. That's fantastic. You guys just keep up the good work. So how have you guys been doing? Did you guys have a good week?
Good. Yeah,
pretty good.
Okay. I continue to be frustrated. I keep looking for an opportunity to go out and get a look at this comet, and it has just been unbroken clouds for about a month and a half.
Yeah. I saw something. I'm currently in Des Moines, Iowa, and I saw something like last week that said that in the last 30 days there had been 3 days that weren't cloudy in Des Moines, that weren't overcast, and today is not a fourth day.
Yeah.
So, but it was a very pleasant drive coming in, so that worked out okay. And so I'm here today. Next week, I think, if I remember correctly, I'm doing this off the top of my head because I'm not doing slides tonight, so I didn't write all this stuff down. But I believe the case is that next week we have Pat. In fact, at one point we even talked about Pat and I talked about the idea of me because I'm going to be in Des Moines all week, and or at least a good chunk of it. We talked about me going up to Minneapolis and us doing it from Chris Carlson's basement. Then Chris informed us that he and his wife are not going to be in town. They're going to be someplace else. So much for that idea of getting together in Chris's basement for the first time in like a year and a half or whatever it is. So we're not going to be able to do that. So
presumably the basement will still be in town.
The basement will still be there. The basement will still be there. But I think
making an entering still.
I think what we're going to end up doing instead is that we'll do the next Battlestar, the next Babylon 5 sequence. So I'm going to spend some time watching Babylon 5. And I was actually in my car today. I finally got a new car. I think I told everybody that. And so my new car has, I can do the Hey Siri thing. And I'm looking over at my phone to see if my phone reacted to that, and it did not. So I can talk to my phone and have it send me text messages. And so I was coming up with ideas for topics for this show. And one of the things I think I'm going to add to the list, in fact, I'm stunned it's not on the list already, is that a guy by the name of James George wrote a book called History of Warships. And so I'm actually going to basically, that's fodder for a bunch of different episodes, because one of the things I want to do is go through and talk about different combat models, because, Star Trek has this tendency to just sort of add ships to Starfleet. Like we got a destroyer and we got a frigate, etc. Well, in the real world, destroyers started off with a particular mission. Now that mission has changed over the course of the last 110 years or thereabouts. But, for a big chunk of that, like up through World War II, destroyers had a couple of specific missions. And so you built destroyers to do a mission. What does Starfleet build destroyers for? A lot of this just sort of seems, in some of the various flavors of Star Trek, some of it seems to be solely based on size, right? Destroyer means small. Frigate means small. Cruiser means bigger. And I'm going to go try to set some of the background for that, set some of the foundation to have like a deeper conversation about how to think about those things in science fiction. And Battlestar Galactica is actually a pretty good place to start in all of this, because one of the things that I need to sit back and do some thinking about, but I know that you guys have from conversations we've had off the air, some thinking about, like, do they really just send Battlestars out by themselves, or do they have escorts? And if they have escorts, what do those escorts do? What's the purpose of those escorts, right? It's probably not to conduct torpedo attacks on the enemy line of battle, right? If you had destroyers, they're doing something else. And, the most obvious model to me is sort of the model of air defense ship, right? cruisers did a lot of air defense work, as did battleships in World War II and beyond. And there was a time period in the United States Navy where cruiser just meant anti-aircraft platform, effectively. And so, is that how they would approach that problem in Battlestar Galactica or not? Maybe it's just about shooting down fighters. I don't know. But I suspect that it's something that we could spend a lot of time sort of pulling the thread on.
Yeah, and some of that is actually sort of the topic for tonight. So why don't we kind of move into slides, because that's kind of a good segue to the first slide after the boilerplate.
Yeah. So now I just need to be able to get my cursor back, because I'm plugged into my sister-in-law's monitors, and it's the path to get my cursor from one screen to another screen is not necessarily intuitive. Okay, so TJ or Rob, over to you.
Sure. All right. So for part 3 of our presentation tonight, we are doing a bit of an inquest into the destruction of Battlestar 62 Pegasus. Next slide, please. My boilerplate, this is almost exactly the same as the last boilerplate, only I've added Starfleet Tactical 99, and I threw on a friend of both Rob and I's by the name of Polish Eagle, who has also been recently rewatching the show and has been helpful in bouncing ideas. I don't talk for an employer. You'd actually say that.
And I need to say the same. As always, TJ has basically just updated the numbers on this, but nothing I say on here should be interpreted as me speaking for any organization I may be an employee of or have been previously. So.
And for the record, that's also true for me. I don't speak for my employer. My employer doesn't speak for me. How about you, Delon?
Not at all.
Not at all?
You know.
Is there anybody in the state of Iowa government that has an opinion about Battlestar Galactica or Starfleet tactics?
Well, I'm sure there's probably a few. Maybe the Iowa National Guard, but
actually, your boss is kind of a geek. He might actually.
Yeah, actually, he probably would.
And anyway, back to you.
All right. Next slide, please. Tonight, we're going to evaluate the performance of the Colonial Remnant forces during the evacuation of New Caprica. Nothing we say should decrease or change your enjoyment of the show. Images from the home video release, spoilers for everything. We don't own Battlestar Galactica. So ends the boilerplate. Next slide, please. And for tonight, we're looking at a focus in the inquest into the loss of Battlestar 62 Pegasus. To recap a bit from the last episode, Battlestars, when they have a heavy gun battery, are first and foremost heavily armored aircraft carriers. The air group is a vital component of both the ship's offensive strike capability and its defensive anti-fighter and anti-missile capability. And especially with Pegasus, takes on a very critical role in protecting the ship from incoming enemy fire. And I would note that there is a very tactically useful, in the Battlestars themselves, they have a tactically useful FTL drive. And the FTL drive is used to get in and to deploy fighters and to get the fighters down and then be able to pull the ships out very, very quickly. Teleporting aircraft carriers.
Which sort of solves some of the problems that you've discussed in some of your fighter presentations, Chris, as far as the carrier wants to be nowhere near the other ships that might be shooting at it because it's got delicate things happening. But a battleship wants to be where it can be. A battleship or a missile boat wants to be where it can deploy those weapons offensively, which tends to be closer. And how do you square that circle? Being in space means that you can armor your launch, your interface better, so your hangar deck can be better protected. So it's an armored carrier that's better armored and more resilient than any armored carrier that we've ever seen. But also, because it's got the FTL capability, you can have that regret of maybe this isn't where I wanted to be in this battle, and I should have thought that out an hour ago when I set my course north instead of west. that scale of tactically useful here may be on the scale of maybe 5 to 10 minutes, but that's still more radically repositionable. That's like Air Force levels of repositionable, not Navy levels of repositionable.
Next slide, please.
Well, actually, I have one more comment on that slide.
Oh, sorry.
I like this screenshot because it gets to the core of where we left off last time in the time of Pegasus, which is where the colonial remnant is at the start of this inquest and why this inquest is important. They start with 2 fully equipped Battlestars. One of them a relatively modern ship, though with a bit of a spotty command staff at this point, and one of them, the Galactica herself, with an older air group and only half her flight decks, but nevertheless a strong, powerful combatant. Having those 2 full Battlestars gives them a lot of strategic and tactical flexibility that we saw on display in the previous show. At Resurrection Ship, we saw bringing both to bear for overwhelming force. At Scar, we saw splitting them up for defending multiple objectives. And with the Battle of the Binary Star System, I think I'm naming that right, in Captain's Hand, we saw the use of a Battlestar for scouting, while presumably the other Battlestar was staying with the fleet on goalkeeper roles. So we saw the flexibility and the power of a 2 Battlestar fleet. They're not going to have that by the time we end tonight. Whose fault is that? What went wrong and whose fault?
Yes.
Because that's a major change.
It is a major change. Thank you, Rob. I hadn't ever really gotten that articulated in my head in a verbal way until that point. Do you have a comment, Chris? You looked like you had a comment there for a second. Okay. Next slide, please. We're going to get the setting. Back during last presentation, we noted the SAR raid to Caprica. During that SAR raid, one of the colonial raptors does a misjump and blunders into a semi-habitable world. It's election season, and the discovery of this planet results in the election of our resident crazy mad scientist, Gaius Baltar, to the office of the presidency on the promise of settling on this world. And as they're getting ready to do this, after Dr. Baltar is elected, there is an element of nuclear terrorism allowed by the fact that Baltar handed over the nuke to the terrorists, which results in the destruction of part of the civilian fleet, and we get a nice nuclear double flash. Well, actually, potentially not a double flash, because double flash is an atmospheric effect. And as soon as I say that now, I realize, oops. You get the nuclear blast signature in orbit of New Caprica. New Caprica is located inside Nebula, which is very hard to see through on Dratus, the radar equivalent. Thus, the Colonials have this perception that setting down on New Caprica is sort of, they're hidden from the Cylons. The problem with that, of course, is that they're hidden from the Cylons in a spot where they just set off a nuclear warhead. You're not really hidden if you've got a light shell that's spreading out at 1C around you. Next slide, please. And then there is a year gap. And in that year gap, the colonization efforts on New Caprica are slapdash at best. We still have significant percentages of the people that are settling down on the planet in tents a year on. This is a force that has ships, that has the ability to produce fighters. I would have expected that they would have been able to at least have like Quonset huts. But no, everybody's still in tents, and the planet is a near ice ball with only about 20% of the planet habitable. And a year in, the the Cylons detect, the Cylons show up, and what I will call the Free Colonial Fleet is forced to jump away from a force of not less than 6 Cylon base stars that show up. I will note the perhaps most interestingly later is the ship that is closest to the camera in that lower image is one of the mining ships. So the Free Colonial Fleet has some intrinsic resource extraction capability, along with both of its battle stars and a number of civilian ships. I would also note that the Cylons do not have FTL sensors. They spotted a light year away about a year after it happened. So while they have some form of FTL communication in the downloaded, they do not have any sort of FTL tracking.
It's really, really inconsistent with what they do and don't have.
The downloading process is the only FTL communications that we see. Everything else is subject to light speed lag.
Yeah, and I don't know that I can't remember if we've got a good idea about exactly how far that download can travel. I could, in some instances, and how long that the resleeving process takes at the other end. Because in some instances, you might want to use that as a communication mechanism.
Yeah, except it stings.
Yeah.
Yeah, but okay, so you don't use it to send out pizza requests. You only save it for important things.
Chris, you don't shoot the messenger.
Understood. Not messenger. Just want to make sure that everybody understands that's not, that's there are military exigencies, and they would do something like that if they absolutely had to.
Yeah.
But it's a concept that it's a concept the Cylons were doing to a certain extent before the arrival of Pegasus. According to the plan, there were Cylons in the remnant fleet that were periodically offing themselves to help update the rest of the Cylons for where the Colonials were and what they were up to.
Oh, I didn't even remember that. I need to go back and rewatch the plan.
The plan is kind of hit or miss.
Yeah, very much so. But in some ways, I look at the prospect of doing a reboot as, okay, now that they've got this story in the can, and maybe the next time they tell this story, they can file off some of the rough edges and explore a few things that they really kind of did haphazardly.
Yeah. So a few comments from people from Jens Knudsen that it's a little bit weak storytelling, that they're intense and not Quonset huts. If you getting out of universe about it, if I recall, they had limits on what they could do for the set on the area where they were filming. So there were, but in universe, presumably this represents a misallocation of resources or bad planning by the Baltar administration.
Yeah, really bad planning by the Baltar administration.
Yeah, or if they didn't think that they were going to stay in that particular location, I can't remember if they were talking about surveying the rest.
Baltar was talking about permanent settlement. Baltar got elected on permanent settlement.
That location on the planet, I don't think they're talking about picking up and moving. Possibly Baltar keeps thinking they might and is reluctant to commit to more permanent investment because of that. But I don't know.
You'd think they could have found a place with less mud.
Yeah.
Could it be
it's atmospheric
military allocation? We have to put all of our resources into protecting this place, that we can't really build anything here.
I would have thought that Quonset huts would have been easy.
Yeah,
but maybe not. Maybe it's just if the idea is that a Quonset hut isn't that much better than a tent, and they've got limited ability to produce Quonset huts, and they don't want to put the miles on the systems, on their metal fabrication systems.
Yeah.
They could also make the argument of, we've already got, so many tents, rather than building these things. We've already got these things in storage. We might as well use them. if we
Yeah,
can't
could
afford
be.
to pay, if we can't afford to put our resources towards something else.
Yeah, could be.
An interesting point about manufacturing capability, looking at the limitations of what that industry can do. An interesting point I was thinking about is that we still see Galactica operating Mark II Vipers when we know they can make a full Mark VII from scratch, which suggests that their production rate of Mark VIIs is potentially not enough to retire all their Mark IIs. That as long as a Mark II is flying, without the command navigation program, I would still expect that, an F-16 on its original flight software is probably still a better airplane than, a Panther
or an F4
or an F4,
Yeah.
for a lot of missions.
Even if you could put a latest and greatest missile on both of them, or the best missile you can provide, or whatever. But anyway, just a thought on that front.
I would also note that while they're in kind of a crap sack situation on the planet, there are stated to have been outlines for contingencies for possible evacuation prior to the arrival of the Cylons.
Yeah, and they can always sort of pull up tents in a way they can't Quonset huts.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I like this comment that Turtek 12 made. Honestly, it bugs me that Rosalind is so quick to airlock Cylons, given that they just go back to their own fleet with all of their intel. So
Yeah.
I forget when they find out that happens.
Yeah. I'm sorry, what?
We know that. I forget when the fleet finds that out.
Yeah, in fact, the first time I watched it, I wanted to go through and sort of keep a running list of when we find out things, or when the characters find out things and when we find out things, because
mini-series.
They know about the downloading by then? Okay.
Leoben on Ragnar tells Adama that they can download.
I need to go back and see exactly what his words are, but so that is kind of a weakness.
Yep.
So Olive has the comment that his pet theory is that the Mark VII really isn't that much better than a Mark II without all the computer aids.
I would have an assertion on that there are a few things about a Mark VII versus a Mark II that are superior, just from the perspective of you're looking at.
It's got a third gun.
It's just at the very least, it's got a third gun, which is one thing. But it may not. Again, it may be that their manufacturing capability is strained enough by supporting all of the other manufacturing they need to do to support the fleet and fleet maintenance and ground side manufacturing and all of that.
Just because you can make both of them doesn't mean that they both take the same amount of resources, including time.
Right.
I don't know that we know that they're making new Mark IIs. They're making new Mark VIIs, but I don't know that they're necessarily making Mark IIs.
That's a good point. They may not be able to make Mark IIs.
But flying Mark IIs are still better than Mark VIIs you have to build if you're limited on your total construction points.
Yeah, a Mark II in the hand is worth a Mark VII in the bush.
Or in the hangar.
In the hangar.
Anyway.
Next, move on to the next slide, please.
Okay.
And after having left, the Free Colonial Fleet has two objectives. The first is to rescue the people and recovery of the ships off of New Caprica. And the second is the continued preservation of the existing Free Colonial Fleet and population. And that's stated to be about 2,000 civilians, and you can sort of estimate the military population of somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500, because both Battlestars are stated to have been at half strength. And that sort of fits with the population numbers that we have.
So what's down on the surface is, I think, the better part of 50,000 people, about 2,000 military, or at that point, mustered out military, call them reserve, and then about 48,000 civilians.
Yeah. We're closer to 45 because there were quite a few civilians that die in the nuclear destruction of Cloud9.
Yeah, I forgot what the last number off Rosalind's board was. I didn't look it up before I started saying that sentence.
We actually get we actually get a number for settled in Crossroads Part 1, but I don't remember what it was.
All right.
Yeah, I don't either.
So we can see,
go on.
We can see here the Free Colonial Fleet as they're planning. They begin planning this operation. The necessity of which, I mean, these numbers are a complete, they can't just hightail it with those kinds of numbers.
Yeah. And Adama is doing planning in the war room with all his little models, and he is, in that moment, he is actually quite mad and is throwing one of his models across the table because he can't quite make the plan work. Next slide, please. To execute whatever plan he has Galactica, he has Galactica's air group, he has Pegasus, he has Pegasus's air group. They get in contact with the resistance that's on New Caprica, and that consists mostly of former colonial fleet officers and crew. And he has the Cylon defector Sharon, who is, at this point, Sharon has married Carl Agathon. So she is now Sharon Agathon. And for the purpose, during this mission, she takes the oath into the colonial fleet. She becomes Lieutenant Sharon Agathon. She will eventually receive the call sign Athena in a later episode. This comes back to the point where the ships are stated as being at half strength, and the New Caprican resistance is stated as being 1,150 armed effectives, which Adama's XO, Captain Carl Agathon, says is a lot less than what he should have, given the number of former colonial officers enlisted that are on the planet. I would note that the air group effectiveness is probably more limited by pilots than it is on aircraft. So they probably have at this point enough, 40 to 60 fighters on Galactica and 150 on Pegasus, but they may only have enough pilots to operate half of those. And
debating what those numbers are part of the reason I was thinking about the decision to keep the Mark IIs in the air.
Yeah, there's an interesting conversation taking place in chat. Rob just chimed in on that. Chat on which one did you put that in, Rob?
That's in the Axanar channel.
In the Axanar channel. At some point, we're going to neck down to only doing this on one. We're not going to. Right now, we've got chat running on both of them. At some point, that's going to change, but not today. Jen's made the observation that they probably have the data packs for the Mark II parts. I think that might be a possibility because those were almost certainly designed on computers, and computer files. You could have the computer files around. I think Rob points out they might not. Even if a U.S. Navy carrier had 3D printer files for F-18s and F-35s, would it have them for F-4s or F-14s? Those were airplanes that were designed on paper. They never had files for those. Right. So I think it comes down to how are those ones produced. If they were produced in a similar mechanism, maybe they would have them.
But even so, having those technical data packages on board, do you have how much space do they take up? How much?
Yeah.
Tooling.
It's not a no-brainer that they would be there. It's not a no-brainer, and it's also not a no-brainer that everybody always makes the assumption that the new thing that replaced the old thing is better, faster, cheaper. And oftentimes that's the case, but it's by no means the case. The Spruance class destroyers had some capabilities that did not make it to the Burks and did not make it to the Ticonderoga class cruisers. And it's because they had a specific reason why they put some electronic gear on, and they concluded that that wasn't going to work, so they just stopped equipping ships with it.
Yep.
That's a good point, and it I don't have evidence that they're not also building new Mark IIs. And if there is something that the Mark II that they're finding in service in the remnant fleet service, that the Mark II is filling some role in a high-low mix or an old-new mix, that, you know, maybe they make a better missile goalkeeper or whatever.
Yeah. Next slide, please. And we do get, throughout the first 2 episodes, we establish that they are going to do a plan. And the mission as planned in the first step, Lieutenant Sharon Agathon is sent down to the surface with a Marine detachment to secure the launch keys for the grounded ships so that they can evacuate the grounded civilians using the ships that are already on the ground. They don't have to bring civilian ships in to get people out. They can just take what's there and go. Notably, at this point, we have confirmation that the Cylon Centurions, the Chrome jobs, as they're referred to, are unable to distinguish between individual human form Cylons. They just see human form Model 8. They don't see human form Model 8 that's allied with the Cylons versus human form Model 8 that's allied with the Colonials. And that is this is a quite an act of trust on the part of Admiral Adama, sending her down.
Mm-hmm.
And it pays off. She successfully executes her mission. So, next slide, please. Pegasus and her air group are going to be left with the Free Colonial Fleet, and that's going to preserve extent, capabilities, and population. As I noted earlier, the mining ship was in the Free Colonial Fleet, which means the Free Colonial Fleet of mining ship plus Pegasus is actually capable of regenerating her physical air wing over time.
Though perhaps at even a reduced rate from whatever she was capable of before they landed most of the civilians and some of the military. But the hardware is all there. They may not have enough people to run it at full tilt. They're probably not running 3 shifts.
No, but they have the ability to physically produce additional fighters. Next slide, please. While Adama is getting ready to come in to help get people off the planet, the local resistance steps up their attacks pretty radically. This resistance had been doing things like suicide bombing beforehand, which, when you're a very limited population against an enemy that can resurrect, is perhaps not the best course of action. Although they are seen as doing suicide bombings, trying to target Baltar. They just are incredibly unsuccessful in pulling that off. Next slide, please. So there's the first step in getting everybody off the planet is to draw the Cylon forces that are in orbit away. They do this with the launch of decoy drones by a group of Raptors with some light fighter coverage. And we see the 2 groups of drones flying in a formation to make it look like they are full-size battle stars to the Cylons. And that's to get the Cylon forces away from the planet so that stuff can happen on the planet for the evacuation. And next slide, please. And to do that, Galactica has to deploy Vipers to provide close air support and counter air coverage over the evacuation. She does so. How does she do so? Next slide. The Adama maneuver or the bucket drop. And Chris, if you could drop that YouTube link I had sent you earlier. If you guys want to watch it, it's an absolutely amazing scene. Adama jumps Galactica into the upper atmosphere with very little forward relative forward momentum. As the ship is dropping through the atmosphere, the fighters are getting launched out of their tubes on the sides, and before it pancakes into the ground, Galactica jumps back out. It's just very dramatic, very fun. It's one of the better science fiction combat scenes. I would rank it up there with Enterprise and Excelsior against the Bird of Prey in the Undiscovered Country. It's Enterprise versus Reliant in the Wrath of Khan. Thank you, Lissa, for having gotten it before with Chris.
Before I could pry it off of out of my text editor.
Hi,
So
a reminder, you have a producer.
Yes. Thank you.
I try not to rely on you being there, Lissa. I don't want to add to your plate.
So
right.
we did just discover something interesting about YouTube, that the plus sign that was on the end of the one that she put in, and it'll work with whether that plus sign is there or not.
Interesting.
Huh.
Yeah.
All right. So I think next slide, unless.
Yeah. And in this moment, Galactica jumps back into a low orbit to engage the base stars directly while the civilians are evacuating. I would note that Galactica has now just done 2 of what we had earlier in this presentation series referred to as short jumping, because she deploys her forces in the nebula within sight of the planet. She jumps from that spot in the nebula to the upper atmosphere, and then from the lower atmosphere back into low orbit. So that's 2 short jumps in the span of sub-minute time periods.
This pause here in orbit may be serving 2 functions. One of them practical and one of them tactical or strategic. The practical one is that a jump just back into orbit may simply be easier on the drives in the circumstance at the bottom of the atmosphere. They have to they presumably had to pre-calculate both of those jumps, and it may simply be that this is the best way to pre-calculate both jumps to do that, rather than having to do a bigger jump. The other thing, of course, is that having Galactica up top, one of the roles we talked about that may exist doctrinally for Battlestars is to soak fire, is to be a big chunk of metal that the Cylons can't resist shooting at.
Yeah.
And having her, the civilian fleet that's powering up and lifting off and jumping out, kind of going back to what we talked about with Ragnar, if the Cylons could get in there and start doing damage, they could kill a lot of people very quickly.
Yes.
They are not doing that. They are completely distracted by Galactica there as a tar baby. So Galactica's here as a sink for Cylon power again.
Yes. Next slide. So everything up through the bucket drop is absolutely successful. The launch keys get secured. The local uprising has distracted Cylon attentions. The decoys drive the raiders and some of the base stars away from the planet. The Colonial Vipers that are deployed during the bucket drop successfully achieve air superiority to air dominance, completely eliminating the Cylon raider presence over New Caprica. And the civilian evacuation is being started. We are getting people onto those ships, and we are starting to get the ships out. So everything through this point has worked. It is a well-executed plan. The problem is, this is when everything goes pear-shaped. Galactica gets back into orbit, and instead of there being 2 base stars in orbit, there are now 4. And Adama's explicit line is, no, we can't take on 4. That said, Galactica does manage to demonstrably eliminate one of the base stars as a threat. So while he can't But while he can presumably handle a 2-on-1 situation, he doesn't feel he can handle a 4-on-1. But he can at least even some of the odds up in that 4-on-1 situation. But the critical point for Adama at this point is he has a base star in orbit without any fighter coverage over him. He has nothing to help keep the Cylons off of his back. And this is bad. This is absolutely bad. Now, maybe this means because he achieves air dominance over the planet incredibly quickly, maybe he put too many of the fighters into achieving air dominance over the planet. Maybe he put the right number in, and if you don't put that many fighters that he put, you don't get air dominance, and now you've got a fight in the atmosphere and civilian ships getting shot down as they're getting ready to jump away. It's kind of hard to just figure out which.
You don't want to be the Russians in Ukraine trying to figure out if you've got enough planes to keep the Ukrainian Air Force down, and the answer is, in fact, no.
Right.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he doesn't have the fighters to help keep his own ship in orbit secure. And his FTL, and he gets his FTL drive knocked out. Now, his FTL drive is knocked out, but the situation does still appear to be stable on the order of minutes. The ship is still fighting. The ship is still firing. He is still holding down 3 Cylon base stars. And while the Cylon base stars are hitting him, they can't hit the planet. So while he's not winning, every minute that he doesn't lose is a minute that he gets that buys the civilians more time. And the civilians getting more time is what this whole mission was about.
I can't remember. Does he say anything about whether they can jump out or not?
The FTL drive has been knocked out.
Okay.
I forget the exact timing of when it's knocked out. I can't remember. I think they actually have a problem with it. They basically can't get the drive to spool back up pretty early.
Right.
Okay. Well, they had been, beating it like a rented mule.
Yeah.
Yes.
2 short jumps in a row, and it doesn't come back up quick for a third. And they
Right.
weren't anticipating needing a third because they thought they could hold down 2 base stars. And then there turned out to be 4 base stars. I think Adama's line is actually something like, we can't hold off 4.
That's it. That's it.
It's not we can't kill 4. Because I don't think he's thinking about killing 2. But he thinks he can hold 2.
Right. And he does successfully manage to kill, or at least mission kill, one of them, because it's not in that shot pounding Galactica with the other.
Yeah, we never see the 4th base star appears to have been taken care of. So if it were just 2, he probably would have knocked out 1 and been slugging it out with the other. And maybe he wouldn't have been beaten up so bad, but he would be doing what he needed to do.
Yep.
But there were 4.
There were 4. Next slide, please.
All right. Hold on a second. Go, Delon.
I got a question for you. Now, I'm keeping something in mind here. First off, I am not nearly as familiar with Battlestar Galactica as the 3 of you. Okay. But something you said earlier versus something you just said now made me wonder. You made it sound like that the Galactica was basically a target, and that the Cylons had a tendency of going after the Galactica no matter what. At least that's the impression I got. Now, maybe I was wrong about that. But then when they come along to this battle, they're sticking around in order to protect the civilians, like the Cylons wouldn't go immediately following them if they decided to bug out. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about using the FTL, but they have other engines that they could move and get out of the way. And if the Cylons follow the same pattern that you kind of described earlier, at least with my understanding, wouldn't they just follow them along and they could distract them away?
They might or might not, and I don't know that Galactica's willing to make. I don't know that Adama's willing to make that guess. I don't know that I would describe that the Cylons would follow Galactica if Galactica left. But I think that given 2 targets in the same area, and one of them's Galactica and one of them's the civilian fleet, the Cylons are prone to hit Galactica.
Yeah, and I think it basically boils down to when they're together, they'll preferentially target Galactica because they can always mop up the civilians later. If they're not together, they'll go after the easy target, which is the civilians.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So that's an interesting question. Let's get through another couple slides, and then we've got sort of an open discussion slide.
Yep.
And we can come back to some of that.
In this moment, Galactica is not doing too well. Pegasus shows up. You get the Tycho runs. You see the shots flying past the camera as you're pulling out from that scene of Galactica surrounded by 3 base stars, and you see Pegasus's main battery guns shots just flashing past. And then you swing the camera around and you see Pegasus, and you get to see the nameplate as Pegasus dives in. Pegasus comes in without her air group and with a kind of a skeleton crew aboard, and this is in direct violation of the Admiral's orders. But to protect Galactica in this scene, Pegasus has to get in really close, which exposes her to direct fire in a way that she's really not designed to do without an air group protecting her. That said, Pegasus manages to knock out 1 base star almost immediately. And you're back to a 2-on-2 situation, which the ships should be able to handle, except Pegasus doesn't have her full crew complement, and Galactica is already damaged.
And as a result, what we see
Is next slide. And as I said, she manages to direct fire kill 1, ram a 2nd, and when she blows up, her flight pod flies off and collides with the 3rd base star. And this intervention on the part of Pegasus buys Galactica time to restore her FTL capability and then jump away. While this is...
Next slide.
While that is going on, the civilians are being evacuated. We are seeing the civilian ships take off, not get very high up off the planet's surface before they jump away. Now, this may be an emergency. This is an emergency situation, so you may be jumping a whole lot closer to the planet's gravity well than you normally would. But you can see that they are jumping away inside the atmosphere. We can see the ring of windows down the hull of some of those liners. They are hundreds, certainly less than 1,000 meters off the surface as they are jumping away. But we also see that when 2 ships are kind of close to each other and one of them jumps, the gravity sort of impacts the ship that's next to it, and it sort of twists around. Next slide, please. And following this, for having gotten his command shot out from underneath him, Lee Apollo Adama is demoted from a commander to major, and that is at least 2 grades. And he is reassigned as the Galactica's CAG. So he is back at being CAG of Galactica, which is where he was before he got himself shot and sacrificed. Is where he was for the first season and a half. Although this time, instead of being under Colonel Ty, he's now under the Captain Agathon, who is still a captain and is the acting XO. So the CAG in this instance is outranked by the ship's XO. Now that particular shot is a deleted scene. But it fits with everything that we then see in the later episodes. What you actually have there is from right to left, we have Agathon, we have the Hoshi, who's one of the senior watch officers from Pegasus. We have the Admiral, we have Lieutenant Duala, who had been Pegasus XO, married to Lee Adama, Pegasus CO, and then we have Commander Adama, former Pegasus CO, and reason why Pegasus isn't there anymore. Now, the Doylean explanation for why they got rid of Pegasus is that they needed the space for the sets. So they needed to get rid of the sets, which meant they needed to blow up. They needed to blow the ship up because they didn't have the space to do those sets and the season 3 Cylon base star sets that they wanted to have. I would note that at this point, for the first time since the fall of the colonies, Adama probably has enough of his mid-level ranks to fill every single position. So people that sort of in the Squadron XO, Squadron CO, he's got multiple options for CAG. He's got 2 possible XOs in the form of Ty, who had spent 4 months leading the resistance on the planet, and Hilo, who's been his XO for the last 4 months. Hilo is really it's really about the only one that's ready to take over, because Ty is not in a good place. And Ty stays in a bad place for another 8 months. Just an interesting perspective on sort of what happens. Next slide. So this sort of brings up to sort of the questions that we want to use to sort of round out tonight, and hopefully some of our audience may be able to have some thoughts too. Was the mission over New Caprica a success? I would argue it is at very least a partial success, in that they successfully evacuated the vast majority of the civilians that were on the planet. What decisions specifically led to the loss of Pegasus? What alternatives could have possibly changed that outcome, and what would the other command staff in the fleet? So that's Colonel Ty, Captain Thrace, Captain Agathon, Admiral Kane, Commanders Fisk and Garner, Major Shaw from Razor, and Lieutenant Duala. Would they make the same decisions that Apollo made?
So one of the conventional things in fandom, beginning this inquest in the blasted radioactive remains of Colonial Fleet headquarters on Pycon, now that we've concluded the review of the logs, the conventional explanation is basically what Mech 1164 says in the Axanar channel chat. Don't buy it. Pegasus is nearly double Galactica's weight, armored better. It's plot required, or it was a stupid decision by Lee. That leaving his air group when he came in was a stupid decision that got his ship killed, which was an unforgivable loss to the capabilities of the colonial remnant. That was not something that could be afforded to be, that he could afford to lose, and that by not bringing in his air group, he failed to fulfill his duty by trying to protect the civilians left with the free colonial, the extracted colonial fleet there. He actually does a disservice to every single human left alive. This is sort of the conventional thing.
Right.
If
it's a very easy to sort of approach. Lee's the one who decides he's going to leave his forces. Lee gets the ship shot out from underneath him. And to be perfectly honest, that's the perspective I had before I started making these presentations.
Lee is making a decision that values protecting the civilians that his father has assigned him to protect. He's leaving. We don't know exactly how many fighters, but I believe Pegasus's air group at this period in the show is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 birds. Now, their decks may be a little light because of the movement of forces down to New Caprica, but even so, he's probably got 30, 50 birds that he could put in the air. We see Galactica protecting a larger fleet with more civilians, with an active number of fighters that are estimated at maybe 20 at some points before Pegasus arrives. And ideally, Galactica and Pegasus are not going to be gone that long.
Yeah. Could
he have left half his birds? Could he have left? I mean, We see, speaking about some of other officers who might have made different decisions. At the start of last episode, we were reviewing the plan that Captain Thrace, Starbuck, is proposing for going back to Caprica with Galactica and most of the air group and leaving the fleet with 7 Vipers and a Raptor for a period of months.
Yes.
Could Lee have done the same and brought 30 or 40 birds with him? And we see the difference that 30 or 40 birds can make in playing missile goalkeeper. We see it we see it at Ragnar. We see it in the miniseries early on. We see it and we see the benefits for Pegasus of a full crew and some Vipers for defense at the Battle of the Binary Star System.
So I forget, was the Pegasus air group out at that time?
They are specifically offloaded.
Yes.
Leo offloads his air group.
So they were on board. He sends them off, and then he moves in.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So
He also evacuates a significant portion of the ship's company that are still
didn't have
aboard.
to wait for wait to recover.
No. As Stephen Ross says, even if he had brought half his air group, it might have made a difference. There's an argument that he didn't roll the hard 6. He didn't go for, and in failing to do that, if you imagine Starbuck in command of Pegasus in that moment, Starbuck probably disobeys the order and goes back. That's very Starbuck.
In fact, I would go so far as to say, of all of the possible command staff, all but one of them disobey the Admiral's order at some point and send Pegasus in to help Galactica get the people out from New Caprica. I'd say the only one that probably doesn't is Lieutenant Duala, and that's entirely based on her statement to Lee about how the civilians that they are protecting, that is their charge, that is the mission they have to do, and if they fail in that mission, doesn't matter what else happens, because there'll be nobody around to remember an admiral named Adama and a Battlestar named Galactica.
Yeah, the one.
I think she's the only one that would actually follow the order.
So,
which is an interesting question, because if they lose Battlestar Galactica, they're losing an inferior ship. They're losing their flag officer. They're losing maybe some of their.
Well, the thing is, if they lose the Galactica, are they also going to lose the ships, the civilian ships that were on the planet?
And that's a good question.
So, do you have to kill those base stars for the civilians to get away? In that case, then Lee pretty much has to go in. The question is, does he go in with his air group or not? And I'm still waffling back and forth on whether he goes in with the air group. But it seems to me that if the key to getting the people off the planet, if you think that in order to survive, you need to get the people off the planet, in order to have a viable population, you need to get the people and the ships off the planet, and the base stars will prevent that from happening, then it's all about killing base stars, and you need to go in prepared to kill base stars.
Which means you've got to bring the air group.
Now, that having been said, he did kill base stars. He killed 3 of them.
Right. With the loss
did.
of the ship. And if he, as Logic's Finest has been saying in, I think, the Ares Studios chat for a while, that we've seen Pegasus kill base stars solo. With her air group, with damage control, with a full crew, we've seen Pegasus kill base stars.
Yeah.
And if he goes in with his air group and we game out that he can send his air group, we see him able to hit base stars at range, which we also saw in Resurrection Ship. Not a huge range, but a decent range where he's not getting hit from multiple vectors. So
right, Resurrection Ship, Razor.
So they can concentrate their flak resources on a single quadrant, which is important with Pegasus because, like we talked about last time, Pegasus's sky arcs are kind of lousy. And so one of the important things when you're flying a Mercury is to concentrate your axis of the threat. So you can put what resources you have towards where they need to be. Getting in the middle, he can't do that, and it's a weakness of the Mercury design, arguably. Where if he can send his fighters and put his fighters over Galactica. But this actually led us to an interesting discussion when we got here, which is we've been talking about Lee's culpability in the loss of Pegasus, that Lee didn't bring his air group, that Lee went in, but we think he had to go in.
Right.
We've been saying almost everyone goes in because they have to go in.
Right. He does.
Justin says Adama probably wouldn't have wanted to set foot on Galactica. We actually see Galactica. Set foot on Pegasus. We actually see him switch his flag to Pegasus when it's required by mission.
In Razor.
So he has moved his flag to Pegasus in order to fulfill mission requirements. And this is where we actually, when we were thinking about planning this out and talking about it for this presentation, we have a suggestion for who's responsible for the loss of Pegasus. And his name is Adama, but his first name isn't Lee.
It's William.
It's Admiral William Adama.
Now, Lee leaves his fighters with the civilian fleet. Intrinsically, this means the fighters are not bolted down to the deck. They are a mobile asset. And the launch tubes on Galactica can fire the Mark 7s out just as easily as they can fire out a Mark II. You've got 40 launch tubes. We know that you could turn around a launch tube in a matter of minutes. What might you do to change the outcome? Adama should have brought some of Pegasus's air group with him.
There are a couple of different ways to do that. One way to do it is to bring Pegasus through the jump into orbit and then have a second launch on board or have more birds that he can put in the air when he reaches orbit. Another option is he can just bring Pegasus in her entirety and have Pegasus set up in the goalkeeper spot in orbit.
Yeah.
The Galactica and Pegasus jump in. Galactica goes down. Pegasus plays top cover. Galactica falls and extracts back up. And Pegasus has already established a defensive globe. Or...
And you can end up with the same outcome. It just doesn't look as bad getting there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Razor is not before the Cylon attack at the beginning of the miniseries. When Adama, go look at not last week's episode, but the previous episode in this series. The portions of Razor are during the miniseries, but not all of it. Portions of it are in the present or more in the present.
Yeah, Razor has 3 parts. There is a part dealt in the first Cylon War. There is a part that dealt with events from basically the miniseries pretty much through about water, time-wise, dealing with what was going on Pegasus, and then there is a second set of events that happens between the captain's hand, a third set of events that happens between the captain's hand and downloaded, and that's the events where Adama transfers his flag.
So we've talked about like Adama could bring Pegasus and her air group as his one Battlestar that he brings and still fulfill his goal of leaving a Battlestar behind with an air group.
Right.
He could bring Pegasus with Galactica and leave only a token cover at the fleet and have Pegasus set up top cover and then Galactica extract back into the shadow of Pegasus. Or an option that TJ and I kicked around is he could just have it lined up. He's only going to get one launch off during the bucket drop. He doesn't have the time to cycle the tubes. We've seen they can park a Viper behind the tube ready to go into the tube for a rapid turnaround. He can have his second launch be portions of the Pegasus air group sitting on Galactica's deck behind the Galactica launch. The Mark IIs go out during the bucket drop, and within the first few minutes in orbit, they cycle the Pegasus birds into the tubes and put the Pegasus air group. But this which allows him to still leave Pegasus and a substantial portion of the Pegasus air group back for the civilians. Right. So We were critiquing Lee Adama for failing to commit all of his resources with the result that he lost a Battlestar. Bill Adama, ironically,
Does the same
making
thing.
the exact same call.
Yeah.
Question.
Yes. Go with Lon.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand this. Okay,
Sure.
the destruction of the Pegasus sounds like it was a desperate bootleg kind of move. This was not the plan, and basically he was flying by the seat of his pants. Correct?
Yes, that is correct. Lee was
Okay.
improvising in a hurry.
Okay, so
And-
let me ask you this. Okay, why didn't they ask for the worst case scenario plan? What would have been the worst thing to could possibly have happened? And why didn't they think of this ahead of time? I mean, I work with IT security all the time, and it's like that's the question me and my cohort are always asking: what's the worst that could happen?
The worst that could happen is the Cylons don't jump 2 more ships into orbit. They jump 10 more ships into orbit, and now everybody's completely outnumbered.
Right, but
they didn't even. I mean, that might be the worst case, but they didn't even ask what's a more bad case. It's almost like they locked in on the idea of, okay, this is the way it is, and it's never going to change, and we're going to make our plan according to this. And then the Cylons changed the plan, and they're like, oh shit, I'm just going to have to make this up as I go.
Well, I just threw a quote from Bob up there. Having met them, I really don't think the showrunners were as space combat savvy as most of the folks here. They're just making a nice spacey show by the seat of their pants most of the time, and I think I think.
I mean, I would in response to that, I'd make the argument of, I don't know as much about space combat as you three obviously do. I mean, for crying out loud, I'm a networking guy for crying out loud. I don't know anything about it, but it's like I still managed to come up with this idea.
This stuff has always driven me nuts. I mean, I always say that, remember the episode where Sulu's on the planet and he and the team are freezing to death because the transporter is splitting people in two?
Yes.
I mean, aside from the fact that, okay, I get it. When you send down power units, they don't work. How about firewood? How about
blankets?
but even aside from that, I just have this image that 2 weeks later, they're sitting in the wardroom, like drinking coffee, and one of them goes, "The shuttlecraft. We could have used a shuttlecraft." But they didn't have the set built at that time.
That's true. But your argument about the firewood or the tents or anything like that,
it drives me nuts the number of times where you could just make tiny little changes and you could cover your bases.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like, it's a real shame we had that crash in the shuttle bay the other day. We could really use a working shuttlecraft right now, right? They could have solved that with like 2 lines.
Yep.
And in this one, you could have had Lee take in the second, Pegasus could have gone in. They could have had the entire air groups involved, and they just ended up dealing with more Cylons than they thought they were going to.
Yeah, there's no we know exactly how many battle stars that Admiral Adama has. They could have had 10 Cylon base stars.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then it would have been Pegasus has to sacrifice herself to get in the way of something to Galactica because Pegasus takes a freak hit and her jump drive is completely out.
Yeah.
But thinking about this back to the inquest, I think that I would say, several people are sort of seeing our point here that it would have made some sense to bring that. That it would have made some sense to bring Pegasus in as a core part of the plan and not as a last-minute improvisation.
Yeah. I think I like this comment. I think that Lee was going Leroy Jenkins on him. So
now I'm curious about something.
Someone does have a point about was it a success? Hermano Fracine. The mission was a success. It achieved the objective, free the prisoners. While the U.S. lost the Yorktown, Midway is considered a great victory. The Japanese failed to achieve their objectives and lost, every carrier they brought. So, and that's definitely true. The mission was successful, but it could have been achieved with less loss. Now, this is all very easy for us sitting around in our comfortable armchairs in the glowing nuclear remains of Colonial Fleet headquarters on
Icon.
Yeah, we're not we're not responsible for making these. We talk about this as the colonial remnant and the ways in which that is not the colonial fleet. And I suspect that if you had presented this as a problem at the War College pre-war, after they would have gotten done arguing all the ways it wouldn't happen, and they sat down and read the war book on what a new base star looks like, and new Cylon raiders and all of this, that they would have come up with a better way to do this. And maybe that looks like one of those three options we considered that maybe Admiral Adama didn't fully consider.
So Turtip 12 has a good comment here. I wonder if there's just a shortcoming in Lee's education as an officer with regard to big ship handling compared to fighter tactics. And I do think it's important to keep in mind two things. First of all, you never know what ends up on the cutting room floor. So it's entirely possible that there is some stuff going on there that we just simply don't know about. Like, for instance, Pegasus had taken some heavy hits a couple of times. Maybe, we sort of look at this as getting rid of, he lost the good Battlestar. I'm not as convinced as other people are that Pegasus was the good Battlestar by that point. I think Pegasus had taken some heavy hits, and I'm not sure that she was doing as well.
That's a valid point. She may have residual damage from the Battle of the Binary Star System or something.
The second thing about this is, I've made the comment with regard to Galactica, and I'll extend it here. First of all, Galactica was kind of a hard luck ship, and it wasn't where you sent the best and brightest. If you ended up on Galactica, you were either really unlucky or you were kind of a screw up. I mean, that's kind of, Starbuck is the classic example. Nobody doubts her talent. It's the fact that she keeps slugging the XO. That was her belting tie was like the second time that had happened in her career.
Yeah, she belted her CAG on her first Battlestar posting.
Yeah, and so it's amazing that she's in the service at all, and it actually says something about the quality of her skill level. That they were willing to put up with that shit, even though she got sent off to Galactica. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that none of the people that, with the exception of Bill Adama and Ty, none of the people there are doing the jobs that they were designed, that they were trained for.
Yeah, Lee had gone to War College, but he'd never gone to finishing school for Battlestar commanders.
Right.
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't know if he met the requirements to be CAG. He just happened to be closest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So even as CAG, he was probably a pay grade or two above where he should have been.
That deleted scene, actually, he notes that the TO the TO&E for a Battlestar is the CAG is supposed to be a senior captain or a major.
Yeah,
and he was a captain at the start of the show, and he gets demoted back down to a major.
But he may be. Just because it says major on his rank insignia doesn't mean that he's got. On the other hand, he's been doing the role of CAG in pretty heavy duty combat for 12 months.
Right. But
he's probably suitable for CAG by then. He might not have been at the start.
Yeah. So senior captain or major sounds like way too junior for that job, right? That's a squadron CO thing, but they don't really have squadrons separate from just the group.
Yeah.
Right?
We do see patches for squadrons,
and we do see some of the squadron organization in the passage.
But of course, it's never alluded. It's never something that's directly shown. It's set dressing. It is literally set dressing and.
In the U.S. Navy, the squadron CO is usually a commander, and the CAG is an 06, is a Navy captain, right? The equivalent of a colonel.
Yeah.
I don't want to make it sound like that's the only way to do things. It's just you sort of look at what jobs you need to have on the way up to being experienced, and how many ranks you have in to get there. And as a general rule, you should probably get promoted every time you do a good job, right? Every time you get that experience.
Turtek notes, we see a squadron patch on Ty's quarters on the wall. We see one in the Agathon's quarters and in Lee's quarters. when Lee's back on Galactica, he and his wife Duala are in married quarters. So we actually see then the married quarters get used for, like, we have 4 different married couples in season 3 that we're dealing with, and we see each of them having their own set of quarters, and all but one of them, and that's because that's the Tyrrells have squadron patches up there. One of the things dealing with that last question, I'm absolutely convinced that Ty would not see the preservation of the civilian fleet to the same degree that Apollo did, which means I think he doesn't leave as many. If he leaves any fighters, he doesn't leave all of his fighters. Starbuck very clearly didn't, because Starbuck was willing to leave a larger civilian fleet with only 7 fighters
and 1 Raptor.
Garner, absolutely having matched Adama's "I'm getting my men." I don't think he sort of runs off and does what, he keeps his air group with him when he runs off in the captain's hand. I think he brings his entire air group with him.
Less for conscious decision making and more due to not considering the possibility of leaving it.
Yes. Fisk, we don't really know much about Fisk's command style. We really can't make a hard call on Fisk. Admiral Kane obviously doesn't go back for the civilians. She leaves all the civilians that are on the planet on New Caprica. We sort of mulled what if Kane but not an admiral back and forth, and it's sort of hard to figure that one out, but it's not in the show, so I really didn't have to put too much thought into it for this presentation.
I want to push back a little bit on Kane. I think Kane goes back just because it's an opportunity to kill Cylons.
That's fair.
That's a valid point.
That's fair, which means Admiral Kane probably goes back with both Battlestars, because it means she can kill more base stars.
And all the fighters.
Yeah.
I don't think she leaves any behind.
No.
Well, I mean, my general point and all that about people operating, a pay grade or 2 above where they should be, is that the amazing thing about this entire show is how well the Galactica performed, considering that, first of all, it was such a dysfunctional command from top to bottom, in such a horrible, demoralizing situation. I mean, the way I always describe it is the 2 things to understand about that ship is that it's a hard luck ship, and so you're not dealing with the A-team, and every single human being in that TV show has the absolute worst case of PTSD you can possibly imagine. Right? So nobody in that ship is in that entire show is actually entirely sane. They're just not. Right? The entire human race is 99.99% of the human race has been wiped out, and the things that did it are coming for me next.
Yeah.
So
I'd say the person who's probably most sane at this moment is Carl Agathon, who's acting as the XO, and that's only because he's got his wife with him.
I like that comment about Space Ahab. Yeah.
No, she's absolutely Space Ahab.
So we've run through our slides. I'm just going to make Liz has been kind enough to not drop in and point it out, but we've run through our slides and we're about 20 minutes over. Why don't we move into wrap up mode?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I was actually just thinking about that. So
we could go on forever.
I would like to
look. I'm just over here along for the ride. I'm reading a comic while you guys keep going.
So Lissa, you missed it last week. I actually went through my slides in 45 minutes. And then I said, it's a shame that Lissa's not here because I'm actually going to finish early. And then I went through the notes and answered questions and stuff. And that
took you
like
40
minutes, another 40 or 45 minutes. So
I will attest to that.
Yeah, actually, it was another 45 minutes because it was almost exactly a 90-minute show, of which it was answering questions. So
we've got at least one more. I'm looking at this, how long this one took. We might seriously be looking at parts 4 and 5.
That's fine. That's fine. I think this is a good conversation, and it's inspired me that I want to go back and rewatch Battlestar Galactica, and the next time take a little bit more notes on it.
What did you say?
I said, I know, right? Battlestar Galactica is pretty awesome. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, I don't want anything we're saying about the decisions that either of the Adamas made that lead to the loss of Battlestar Pegasus. We're not here to conduct a court-martial on the show. We're just here to conduct a court-martial on the ad.
Some mistakes were made along the way, and people were sacrificed.
And one important thing about Lee's decision to grab the Pegasus and head back is that decision was made very fast because it had to be made very fast.
And that's part of why I think that Bill set Lee up for a bad call there, because he left him in a situation where I think the right answer was to go back. I think Lee made a good decision in going back. Not bringing his air group he kind of had to make that decision in about 45 seconds.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you can argue it either way. And, it's this stuff is hard. And, for the record, I always made a point of, I spent a lot of time watching naval officers do their thing. And this is exactly the sort of question that if I had been asked while I was sitting there wearing my, with my CNA ball cap on and, holding the notebook and with my CNA ID, if somebody would have asked me what my opinion is, I wouldn't have given it. Right. If this were a real world incident, I would have said, I am not qualified to make that call.
The other complicating factor with that is that when you were doing that, it was not a crisis situation.
There's a great line from John Partial and Tully's Shattered Sword, where they're talking about people critiquing Nagumo's decisions around when to land different parts of his air group and when to rearm different parts of his air group, where he's talking about it's very easy to make these decisions from a nice armchair 50, 60, 70 years removed from the events. However, when you look at it, Nagumo had to make these decisions under near constant active American air attack. Ineffective, but active American air attack, off and on for the better part of 4 hours. In front of the ship's operational staff in a room that's like the size of my home office with like 20 guys crammed into it. And, it's a lot easier to critique Bill Adama and Lee Adama's decisions without having to be in the room doing it. Even if Lee had given thought to what he was going to do as soon as Galactica jumped away and he was the officer in command for a week or 3, he had to execute all his decisions in the room with the people he had there.
The events that take place over the first 5 episodes of season 3. So that's Occupation, Precipice, Exodus Part 1, and Exodus Part 2. And then Collaborators. Those events take place over about 7 to 8 days.
Yeah.
And the serious there's presumption that there was some planning done for evacuation prior to that. But it's a very densely packed. Battlestar Galactica has a whole lot of this. When you go back and you actually look at like the episode timing, they spend you end season 2 with a 1-year time jump, like 15 minutes before the end of season 2.
Yeah.
And then you come back and starting in season 3, 4 months later, 134 days into the silent occupation of New Caprica. So you've had a year time jump, then you've had a 4-month time jump. And then you spend those first 5 episodes spending basically a week. And then episodes 6 through 10 take place over 8 months. The show is really is really variable in how much time is actually taking place between episodes.
So for what it's worth, the discussion about Shattered Sword, both Rob making the comment and the extended discussion in the chat, I don't know Tully. But John has said that he's willing to come on the show at some point.
That would be really cool.
That would be a lot
Yeah.
of fun.
And so it probably wouldn't have been this next weekend up in Minneapolis, because I want to reread his book. If I'm going to have people come on like that, I need to sit down and sort of think about it a little bit more. And I wasn't going to have time to do that this week.
No, I needed an excuse to reread Shattered Sword. Whatever will I do?
Yeah,
I've only done that about a dozen times.
I'm still working on the Nixon space policy book. So
yeah, it's not a bad thing to have to reread it and stuff, but it is going to take some time to do that.
Yep.
So there's plans. I've talked with John Henry about him coming on. I've talked with Walter Hunt about him coming on. I've talked with other people about them coming on, and Trent Hone is also willing to come on. Harris Lanning's been dead for 70 plus years, so I'm probably not going to get him.
If you do, let me know.
I will.
Logic's Finest says
the steak to put into his heart.
I was to say, if you do, we probably need to call an exorcist.
Yeah,
Logic's Finest says the webisodes cover several-month gap and show a few of the suicide missions. Yes, they do. Those are the Resistance webisodes. It's one of two sets of webisodes that show up with the show. The other set was set in season 4, and it's Face of the Enemy.
That's the one on the Raptor.
That's the one on the Raptor, and none of them actually impact space combat. So that's why it didn't get included.
Yeah.
They're definitely worth watching if you're doing a rewatch of the show. It's got some good character explanations for why one of the characters who had been a deckhand on Galactica joined the Cylon-directed New Capricorn police force. Because Ty was building explosives right outside the Ty was chemically cooking up explosives right outside the hospital. Colonel Ty, in running the Resistance, is not running a clean Resistance. He's running a very dirty Resistance.
Aren't they all?
Yeah.
Aren't they all?
That said, we are now at an hour and 27 minutes, almost 28.
I think we're just shooting the breeze at this point.
Yeah, I would like to thank you for having both of us on. I'd like to thank my co-presenter, Rob. This was one that he had a whole lot of interest in sort of helping put together. And I think it really shows. So I would also like to extend my thanks to him for this one as well. And I look forward to seeing you guys next time.
And I would like to thank you both for being on and doing this and for coming back. That would be fantastic. I'm looking forward to that. Thanks to Delon for providing the venue here. Like he said, the internet connectivity is way better here than at our dad's house. If I was there, it would be like this the entire time. And I look forward to doing this again next week. I think, like I said, next week is probably going to be a Babylon 5 fest. And I need to talk with Pat about that and confirm that last I heard he was going to be on next week. So,
well, that'll be good. That'll give Rob and I time to figure out if we need to split the last section into 2.
Feel free to split it into 2. I mean, we went 90 minutes on this one, so feel free to split it into 2.
If people have any comments that they want to leave after this, or if you've been typing a comment during the show, I believe it is the Aries Studio video that sticks around.
Yes.
Yeah. So take a look for that one to leave any questions if you have any comments.
And Stogie and I are going to sort that out. There's a few things that need to happen first. I need to get access to a few things so that I can go and leave messages on the YouTube and in a few. So working through it, but it seems like every time I put that on my to-do list, I end up spending time in the hospital.
So maybe we shouldn't do it for your health.
It's just a coincidence, but it does mean that it hasn't gotten done. So
Oh, and I'd like to also extend a thanks to all of the audience. We've had some wonderful audience. We always have great audience participation.
Yes.
But we've
Yeah.
had some absolutely wonderful audience participation this week, and I really appreciate that. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I do too. The audience participation has been great.
Elon has something to add.
Not really add. Well, sort of. Two things. One, I do like doing this, even though I cannot really contribute all that much just because of my background and my lack of experience in this. The other thing, and Chris, would you slide over that way a little bit? I want to point out something.
Okay.
There's a fan.
If I walk out, when I'm in my office and I walk out and look at the windows, this is what I see. This is the state capitol of Iowa. I'm very proud of it, and I've always believed that it's one of the best looking buildings in the Des Moines area. Now, that being said, I have no idea how old this picture is because I cannot for the life of me think of any place where there are flowers like this with this angle. So it's like, this tells me that this is probably a 30, 40-year-old picture. But that's the building I used to work in. And I work in a building that is approximately 200 feet from there. So I go to the window and that's what I see. So I'm very proud of that building if you haven't figured it out.
It's a good building.
It is a good building.
So,
yeah. So with that, I think it's time to say goodnight, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.